We have a new artist in our stable of artists, and I wanted to introduce you to him. His name is Gregory Warren Wilson. I find his work different and extraordinary, and I hope that you might like to find out a little bit more about it. Reading about your past training and many talents, it appears you have accomplished a great deal in your life already. From the age of 7, you were collecting fragments of glass and curating them on your bedroom windowsill in Canberra. Perhaps this was inspired by your grandfather, who was a celebrated glass artist working in stained glass, some of which can be seen in St Catherine's College, Cambridge. Your first poem was published when you were 8 years old. You trained in dance at the Royal Ballet School for 6 years, then studied the violin and composition at the Royal College, and have performed classical music and opera worldwide. Your art has been exhibited in Australia, and now your glass mosaics in the UK. Was glass the first material which attracted you as a child?
Yes, in that this little stained glass window which I made as a child with plasticine and bits of broken glass which I hauled out of the river, which was very close to where we lived, was enchanting to me, though to nobody else. And I wrote a little label underneath which said, "This is my stained glass window." So yes, even though it was just bottle glass, blue, green and brown, amber, stuck on the window with blue plasticine, it enchanted me.
You are known for your paper mosaics, which have been exhibited extensively in Australia. How did you arrive at that craft and form of expression?
They actually started by my wanting to make a visual representation of a section of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, the very first 8 bars of the Dance of the Young Girls. And I laid out in black papers and orange paper exactly how the displaced, syncopated, aggressive stresses fell in relation to the bar lines. And this enthralled me because all of a sudden, instead of music being an acoustic enterprise, it was suddenly a visual one. Now, a score is a visual one, but it doesn't mean anything to me particularly. It's just a transcription of the composer's imagination. But when it's turned into colour, it suddenly becomes very interesting indeed. And of course, musicians talk all the time in terms of colour. You know, can we darken the sound here? Can we have a more brilliant sound, more golden sound from the brass and so forth? It's all in play the whole time as a musician. Colour is absolutely our palette of working. But actually to realise a section of a Stravinsky score into something which can be played rhythmically, quite literally played, was very exciting to me. And I went on working and so it went on.
So this knowledge of paper mosaics must have been a natural step in a way to glass mosaics. Would you say so?
What I did in paper was to work with very, very precisely measured strips of paper which I then cut into rectangles and disposed them very carefully in the way that I'm still doing now, disposing them very carefully, balancing colour. And that's something which is very interesting to me, always has been, how a design can appear as though it is in the best possible way and yet be asymmetrical.
I sense the abstract nature in your work, always, but it seems to me also that going further, you could be described as an abstract colourist.
Well, that's entirely flattering. A very nice idea altogether. I am enthralled by colour. It's a sort of enrapturing thing to me, and how to make, or rather how to allow colour to speak one in relation to another takes a great deal of consideration, of course, as you'd expect. But with glass as a medium, it's particularly complex because any one piece of glass is quite a number of colours. In fact, it's quite hard to know what you're talking about when you say this piece of glass is blue, because it's both azure and aquamarine and goodness only knows what, any number of colours represented in one piece of glass simply because of the way the light falls onto it and through it. And of course, as soon as you put one piece of glass behind another, then you have a new spectrum. And this is very much what I've sought to engage with in these pieces, which are laid out on more than one layer of glass. So the potential of this medium is absolutely inexhaustible to me. It's a lifetime's work 25 years designing in paper, and now I've moved into glass, which has a sculptural element because these deep frames allow light to penetrate, and so how the light is bouncing around informs how the eye apprehends these pieces.
These are very close to your poetic mind, and I wondered if you ever started off on a work with a poem in mind or a line in mind.
Yes. I think one can never really legislate for what an artist does, or a poet for that matter. But I can say quite precisely about these 5 pieces. I set out and made them in sequence, starting with the one on that side, in response to Wallace Stevens's sublime poem, Sea Surface Full of Clouds. So they are a very personal response to his 5 stanzas. In fact, his poem is so suffused with colours that it was actually rather difficult to decide which part of any one stanza to form a correlative of, if you could call it that, because there were so many options. But I homed in on a particular part of each stanza and responded to it, so I could identify very precisely in his poems where these were sourced, but actually it's through a lens of my own imagination as well.
So Sea Surfaces is an extraordinary poem. I have read it and it is mind-blowing. I think to respond to it in this way is quite astonishing. Do you know anybody else who makes work such as this?
No, in short. I am a poet. I've published 5 collections. It's a very big part of my life. But it's also a rather inaccessible discipline to a lot of people, and I understand that and respect it. It was quite inaccessible for me for many years as well. I just wrote jingly-jangly rhymes. But actually what poetry is doing when it lifts off into its own unique realm is very, very sophisticated, or at least some poems are. Not all poems have to be sophisticated, but at its most elevated, it's really quite a distilled art form. So it needs to be very abstracted in order to interest me. Otherwise it's illustrative, and I'm not trying to make illustrative work at all. I'm interested in how the imagination engages with the subject which any poem is presenting through the poet's imagination, but I'm never trying to flesh that out. It's done perfectly in the poet's own work.
Well, I think you've made a very extraordinary contribution to Wallace Stevens' life by doing this, and I think whoever acquires it will be extremely lucky. It's a rare idea and a rare piece of beautiful work. We haven't actually discussed about how difficult it is to reconcile cubes, rectangles, and different heights and hand-cut awkwardnesses that come about.
Yeah, exactly. So in relation to that very question to do with how do I reconcile irregularly formed pieces, you do need several thousand pieces from which to choose. Let it be said, without that resource, you're going to end up with an irreconcilable mess. And if, for example, if we just look at that single red square, that's actually been chosen extremely carefully so that it is the most cubic piece of many hundreds. And that enables me, in that instance, to reconcile it in a largely grid-like pattern without too much difficulty. Some of the other work, however, uses a more complex disposition of both cubic and rectilinear tesserae, and that takes a completely different kind of reconciliation. Hours and hours of work. I don't mind that at all, but you do need the resource of the mosaics, otherwise you couldn't actually make a piece which is coherent.
This piece on the wall is to do with Venus, I believe.
That's right.
And the mother of pearl.
Yes.
Could you tell us more about that? The colours are simply beautiful.
Thank you. I've called this piece Venus Overseas, the Making of Mother of Pearl. And in my imagination, the one highlighted silvery cube is Venus as a star. But when I've discovered, when people look at this piece, they think of that as a pearl in the sea. So I've actually, with my framer, arranged that this piece can be hung equally well, either way up.
So we have here a still life, I would describe it as, with one of Gregory's art pieces in glass above the Halima Cassel Concentric Circles is its title. Colour-wise they seem to relate very nicely, and also the geometry that Halima has drawn from her Asian background and Mughal architecture is sort of speaks to Gregory's piece, I feel. It's different to his other work in that it is very abstract, and I wondered if he could explain a little bit how it came about. Its title is Homage.
There's a sense in which it's an homage to two things. One, Ben Nicholson, who I think is one of the greatest British artists ever, and also to a Greek poet, Cavafy, who wrote an extraordinary brief poem about a delivery boy delivering a parcel in a very beautiful old house. And while the parcel is being received, the mirror, and I've imagined this curved mirror shape to be the very mirror in question, beholds this beautiful youth, and the mirror is changed thereby forever because of what it's seen. So it's a very, very beautiful poetic image. And this is not a literal transfiguration of the poem in any sense, although obviously it's got mirror in it. But I liked this idea of slightly mysterious shadows intersecting and the curve of the mirror being reflected and amplified in other curves in other places. So it doesn't seek to represent, but it does respond to this particular poem. There is a pair here, exactly the same size, 30 centimetres square. And the one on the right is called the Constellations of Solitude, and the one on the left is called English Rain, seen through the pantry window. So as you can see, the titles I give these pieces are quite poetic, I think it's fair to say, quite unembarrassed in their enjoyment of language and the imaginative sort of lift-off point.
It seems to have a very meditative feel about it, and it floats quite beautifully in the way you've set it. I think it's a very spiritual piece, actually.
It invites the eye to rest in rather a meditative state, just as you said. The glass appears to be floating in space, almost like a mirage or a kind of spectral appearance of colour, or a visionary sort of coalescing of colours in space in front of this figured glass, which is sometimes visible and sometimes not, depending on the angle at which the light falls on the back of the piece. So it was a particularly difficult piece to frame because it needs to be secured within the frame so it doesn't become amorphous, and yet it needs to have this feeling of almost disintegration into light.
So I'm looking at a picture by Gregory which is called English Rain, seen through the pantry window. And I'm rather interested as to why he should find English rain so fascinating enough to spend a lot of time describing it in a mosaic.
I think English rain is particularly evocative for me. Having been born in England, then lived in Australia and lived in Italy subsequently, the play of light is very, very influential, one way or another. And English light, when I'm abroad, I have a particular kind of nostalgia for because of its exquisite subtlety. So this is a piece about that feeling which rain conjures within the onlooker while looking at rain through, as I've imagined it, a pantry window. So it's quite a fun piece in that the glass behind, as with the Constellations of Solitude, is actually the kind of glass from 1960s, which might well have been used in a pantry window. So there's a kind of interplay between the configured mosaics and the backing glass, which is just like a kind of spectral suggestion behind. But yes, it evokes within me personally that feeling of watching very English rain. This piece I've called On First Seeing the World Through the Eyes of a Sandpiper. And it was in part inspired by Elizabeth Bishop's very celebrated poem, Sandpiper. And of course, what the sandpiper does is to tread with immense delicacy on wet sand as the waves recede, looking very, very carefully at what is left on the sand. And this is a kind of representation of the sand. One of the most beautiful things about Bishop's poem is that it ends with the word amethyst, gorgeous word to end with. And of course there are amethyst cubes in here, mixed with twinkling silver cubes, as though the sea has just receded, leaving the wet sand available for the sandpiper or for us to look very, very closely at. Of course, quite what you see is almost impossible to elucidate, because the nature of the glass means that one's looking through facets and through angles, and so it's different from every angle as you walk past it. The whole thing becomes alive. And this one is called Persimmon Tree in Winter. Uniquely, this piece is in response to a poem of my own. The idea was presented in Umbria when I was on a train late one winter evening and saw a persimmon tree completely denuded of its leaves, but with all its fruit, crop of fruit, ripe fruit, hanging on this tree against an agate sky. An extraordinarily beautiful vision. And it stuck in my mind. It might have been 20 years ago, and then the poem eventually became accessible to me, to do with transience and things moving into and out of shot across through a train and through the period of one's life as well. So in short, this is not a depiction of a tree, but it's certainly inspired by that vision of ripe fruit hanging in space.
Thank you very much indeed for coming to give us this talk about your work. It's fascinating, and I think anybody who sees this film, and even better sees your work in the flesh, will understand you are asking us to look at things in a different way, to look at what's really there, at what we see, and how we see it. And it works on so many levels, and it's very subtle and beautifully constructed with wonderful abstract designs. Anyway, whatever it is, it seems to me a completely exquisite body of work, and thank you for bringing it here and for coming to talk about it. Congratulations.